A billionaire bet billions based on an Excel mistake, a single wrong cell, and it collapsed everything. In 2010, two Harvard economists published a study that reshaped global policy. Entire countries slashed healthcare, education, and public pensions because of it. But behind their bold claim was a spreadsheet. Broken, miscalculated, and no one checked. Until one student did. What he found exposed a global illusion and a silent system of manipulation hidden behind academic respectability. This isn't just about numbers. It's about how truth gets edited and who profits when it does. So how did a single academic paper become the blueprint for global suffering? Let's open the first file, the Harvard threshold. It began, as most dangerous ideas do, with a graph. In the spring of 2010, Herndon Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, both Harvard economists, both with sterling academic reputations, published a paper with a terrifying conclusion. Once a country's public debt exceeds 90% of its GDP, economic growth doesn't just slow down, it crashes. Not dips, crashes. According to their chart, the average GDP growth in high-debt nations dropped to negative 0.1%. Negative growth, recession territory. A red zone with a clean, round threshold, 90%. It was elegant, clean, convincing. Too clean. Politicians, desperate for academic justification after the 2008 crash, seized the paper like gospel. Within weeks, it was being cited in the European Parliament. Months later, it echoed through Washington, D.C. in Paul Ryan's budget proposals. The Reinhart Rogoff study, they called it, as if it were law. But no one was asking the obvious question, why 90%? Why not 88 or 94? How did two economists draw a blood-red line across global economics and convince the world it was real? Behind closed doors, financial advisors began whispering the number, 90, the new fiscal cliff. If your country crossed it, investors pulled out, currencies shook, hedge funds bet against you. One such hedge fund, still anonymous in public filings, moved billions in anticipation of austerity waves triggered by that single line. Sovereign debt shorting, economic collapse as opportunity, all based on a spreadsheet. And still, no one asked to see it. You'd think with trillions of dollars and the future of entire populations hanging on a few lines of math, someone would double-check the formula. But the aura of Harvard, the urgency of the crisis, and the convenience of the answer made everyone look away. Until one university in Massachusetts assigned a replication task to a graduate student. Just a routine exercise, just another paper to double-check. His name was Thomas Herndon. At the time, barely 28. Unknown, unpublished. And when he reached out to Reinhart and Rogoff for the original data, they sent it without hesitation. That's when he opened the file. At first, it looked ordinary. A spreadsheet. Rows, columns, growth rates, debt levels. Just numbers. Until he noticed something strange. Australia was missing. So was Canada. Denmark, Belgium, major economies gone from the calculations. Then came the cell, one cell, misaligned in Excel's averaging formula. It excluded 5 rows of data, 5 countries that, when included, would have pushed the average growth rate far above 0. The entire foundation of the paper collapsed in minutes. But Herndon didn't go public right away. He knew what this meant, not just for academic pride, but for policy. People had lost jobs, pensions, access to medicine, all because of that graph, and that graph was wrong. He spent months verifying, alongside his professors Michael Ash and Robert Pollin, triple-checking, documenting, preparing for the inevitable backlash. When they finally published their correction in April 2013, the reaction was volcanic. Some called it a footnote, others a scandal. But to those who had suffered under austerity, it was something else entirely. Proof that the system was broken and no one at the top was really watching. And if you think this story is just about academic error, think again. Because here's the real question. Why were those countries removed in the first place? What if the mistake wasn't a mistake? And who had the most to gain from keeping the threshold right where it was, at exactly 90%? If you're finding this unsettling, you're not alone. These are the kinds of truths we uncover here. Quiet manipulations hiding in plain sight. You might want to subscribe, just in case this file disappears, because what comes next makes the spreadsheet look innocent. When Thomas Herndon opened the spreadsheet, the first thing he noticed wasn't the formula error. It was the silence. Entire countries, Australia, Canada, Belgium, New Zealand, simply weren't there. Nations with strong economies and high debt levels excluded from the most influential economic paper of the decade. The reason? Reinhart and Rogoff claimed they were applying selective criteria, methodological filters, standard academic procedure, they said. But Herndon wasn't convinced, because when he re-included those countries, the numbers changed dramatically. Instead of an average growth rate of minus 0.1% for high-debt countries, it jumped to plus 2.2%. That's not a rounding error. That's a policy reversal. And yet, it went unnoticed for years. The spreadsheet had been cited in policy debates across the US, Germany, the UK, and the IMF. High debt kills growth had become a mantra used to justify budget cuts, tax hikes, and mass privatizations. But here's the twist. The countries left out weren't economic outliers. In fact, they were key case studies that contradicted the narrative. Take Australia. In several years with debt above 90%, it still posted strong economic growth. Same with Canada. Their inclusion would have weakened the central claim, made it less dramatic, less headline-worthy. So why were they left out? Was it academic bias, a subconscious desire to fit the data to the theory? Or was something else at play? Herndon never accused anyone directly. He was careful, respectful, but the implications were radioactive, especially when you look at who benefited from the mistake. In 2010, global financial elites were desperate to restore confidence in the system. The crash of 2008 had left scars. Governments had spent trillions in bailouts. Public anger was boiling. Austerity wasn't just economic theory. It was political theater, a signal to markets, we're taking this seriously. And Reinhart Rogoff's paper gave that theater the script. Conveniently timed, flawlessly academic, and now we know, deeply flawed. But here's where it gets darker. Because buried in Herndon's analysis was something even more disturbing than the Excel error or the missing countries. Something that suggested this wasn't just bad math, it was structural. Reinhart and Rogoff had weighted countries equally, regardless of how many years of data each one provided. That meant one bad year in New Zealand counted as much as 2 decades of British economic performance. The result? Volatility was amplified, recessions looked deeper, debt appeared more dangerous. Statistical decisions that, on the surface, looked neutral suddenly shaped the entire conclusion. Who made those decisions, And why were they never questioned until a graduate student ran the numbers? You see, this isn't just a story about Excel. It's about how power hides behind complexity, about how economic truths are built, not discovered. And if a spreadsheet this influential could go unchecked, what else has slipped through? What other narratives, sold as fact, were engineered in silence? The next chapter doesn't just question the paper, it follows the money. Because behind every academic idea that reshapes the world is someone positioned to profit. The mistake had been made. The paper had been published. The myth had taken hold. And far from the classrooms of Harvard or the dusty corners of economic journals, someone was watching closely, not for policy, but for profit. In a Manhattan office high above the skyline, a billionaire hedge fund manager stared at a clean number, 90%. He didn't care how Reinhart and Rogoff got there. He cared that governments believed it. Because belief moves markets. In 2010 and 2011, as the study spread through Washington, Brussels, and London, austerity swept the globe. Countries began slashing budgets, privatizing assets, and hiking taxes, not because they wanted to, but because they were told the alternative was collapse. And collapse creates opportunity. The hedge fund began positioning itself accordingly, betting against sovereign debt in high-risk countries, shorting currencies that might crumble under fiscal tightening, and quietly buying distressed assets, the kind that go on sale when public sectors implode. Billions were moved, not based on insider information, not based on earnings reports, but on one academic threshold, baked into a spreadsheet no one had audited. And here's where it gets surreal. Leaked internal memos from 2011, later published in Financial Investigations, show that multiple firms had created models with a Reinhart Rogoff trigger. In other words, once a country's debt passed 90% of GDP, they'd begin executing trades automatically. This wasn't just a theory anymore. It was code. But the paper had problems, and not just the ones Herndon would later uncover. Even in its early days, some analysts noticed the missing countries, the questionable weighting, the unusually small data set. Still, no one pulled the brakes, because when billions are in motion, truth becomes inconvenient. The hedge fund strategy paid off. As Greece descended into chaos, as Portugal cut pensions, as the UK launched its age of austerity, the firm's positions soared. Profits surged into the hundreds of millions, then billions, and yet none of it was illegal. No market manipulation, no accounting fraud, just weaponized belief. A financial world ready to exploit any story that enough people found credible, no matter how flawed. Now ask yourself, who really authored the consequences of that spreadsheet? Was it the economists who published it, the politicians who cited it, or the investors who turned it into machinery? Here's where the narrative fractures. Because when Herndon's paper finally went public in 2013, exposing the Excel error, the exclusions, the flawed logic, the market didn't crash. No governments reversed course. No billionaires gave the money back. The correction came too late. The trades had cleared, the policies were in place, and the world had already been reshaped by a false threshold, printed on Harvard letterhead, and monetized by those fast enough to capitalize. But there's a final twist. Because the hedge fund's trades weren't just passive reactions to economic policy. They were part of a feedback loop, where belief drives action, and action reinforces belief. By betting on collapse, they helped create the conditions for collapse, and the myth became real. But what happens when the system knows it's built on illusion and decides to keep going anyway. In the next chapter, we leave the spreadsheet behind and follow the student, because not everyone was ready to stay silent. Thomas Herndon didn't set out to expose a global illusion. He was a graduate student, 28. No Wikipedia page, no think tank behind him. Just an assignment. Replicate a famous economics paper. See if the results hold. What he uncovered should have ended the conversation. But instead, it started something else. After months of verification alongside his professors, Herndon co-authored a formal rebuttal. The tone was respectful, the data meticulous. No accusations, just corrections. But the implications, nuclear. Reinhart and Rogoff's study was no longer just flawed, it was discredited. The 90% threshold was mathematically unsound. The core conclusion reversed. And yet, the system barely blinked. That's when Herndon realized he hadn't just found an error. He'd stepped into a machinery designed to absorb it. Within hours of the correction going public, media outlets scrambled. Some praised the healthy debate, others downplayed it as an academic footnote. Reinhart and Rogoff responded defensively, acknowledging the Excel mistake but standing by their thesis. But behind the headlines, the tension was palpable. Emails leaked from senior economists showed quiet panic. The IMF, which had cited the study multiple times, began walking back its austerity recommendations. European officials avoided press questions. And yet, nothing changed. The policies stayed. The budgets remained slashed. The belief held firm, not because it was true, but because it had already been priced in. Herndon did interviews, TED Talks. He became a quiet symbol of resistance, but he wasn't celebrated like a whistleblower. He was inconvenient, too smart to ignore, too threatening to elevate. And soon, the narrative shifted again. Sure, the paper had flaws, pundits said, but the overall message still matters. Debt is dangerous. We just need more research. The original claim was fading, but the fear it unleashed, that stayed. This is how systems protect themselves, not by suppressing the truth, but by neutralizing it, diluting it, spinning it into ambiguity. Herndon exposed the foundation, but the structure remained. And here's the final irony. While the billionaire bet paid out, the student who uncovered the lie returned to a modest academic career. No foundation, no book deal, no hedge fund. Because in this game, accuracy doesn't pay. Certainty does. But Herndon left behind something powerful. Not a theory, but a precedent. Proof that even the most respected ideas, dressed in authority and published in prestige, can collapse under the weight of a single question. Can I see the spreadsheet? And that question still terrifies them. Because if one student with no title, no lobby, and no power could unravel a trillion-dollar narrative, what happens when others start opening files too? What happens when the next illusion isn't academic, but structural? And what if we've already been living inside it without ever checking the formula? We like to believe the system is built on precision, numbers, models, charts. But sometimes it's built on convenience, on narratives that serve power before they serve truth. A single spreadsheet error helped justify a decade of austerity. It fueled political speeches, moved billions through global markets, and reshaped the lives of people who never saw it coming. Not because it was accurate, but because it was useful. And here's the uncomfortable part. The system didn't fail because of the mistake. It worked exactly as designed. A paper was published, a story was sold, a fortune was made. And when the truth came out, it was already too late. We still talk about deficits. We still fear debt. The narrative lives on, detached from the data that once held it up. So the next time you hear a statistic, a threshold, a line that sounds too clean to be questioned, ask who benefits. And if you're still watching, it probably means you're the kind of person who asks those questions, who doesn't accept the first answer, who reads the footnotes and checks the formula. If that's you, this won't be the last secret we uncover. So hit the like button, subscribe, because the next illusion might already be in motion, and by the time they admit the mistake, the trade will already be done.